On behalf of the Louisiana Center for the Book in the State Library of Louisiana, thank you for joining us for this virtual 2021 Louisiana Book Festival presentation. This program is Overground Railroad, the Greene Book and the Roots of Black Travel in America with Candacy Taylor and Erika L. Greene, and is presented in partnership with the Capitol Park Museum. Candacy Taylor is an award-winning author, photographer, and cultural documentarian. Her work has been featured in more than 50 media outlets, including The New Yorker and The Atlantic. She is the recipient of numerous fellowships and grants, including those from the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University and the National Endowment for the Humanities. She lives in Harlem, New York. Councilwoman Erika L. Greene is a native of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and a product of the East Baton Rouge public school system. After graduating from Bel Air High School, she received a Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice with a specialization in juvenile justice from Prairie View A&M University in Texas. At graduation, Greene received the highest student honor, Student Humanitarian. She returned to her hometown to attend Southern University Law Center, where she received her Juris Doctorate. Ladies and gentlemen, Candacy Taylor and Councilwoman Erika L. Greene.
This morning, they're like, why would she really care about a book and experience called Rebirth? Well, my minor is English, and my nonprofit is a co-partner in this exhibit as well as the Greene Book lecture series or author series. And so Imagination Leads is a nonprofit started by myself about 5 years ago that focuses on promoting literacy in the African American community. Our goal is to bring in cultural literature for young people, as well as to get their families excited about reading. We also promote cultural activities with the young people. We take them to historically Black colleges, as well as we have taken them to the opera, and just went with Louisiana Opera. And we've also taken them on numerous trips and just cultural events. The other part of our program with Imagination is to mentor young women of color. And so we connected to business women in different communities, especially in the North Baton Rouge community. So Imagination Leads is online, but I was very happy when they asked me to serve as a moderator, but also to serve as a co-partner in the book series. And we have went through, this is our second book, and I'm so excited to be able to moderate the discussion with Candacy Taylor. The book is called Overground Railroad, and it's the Greene Book and the Roots of Black Travel in America. Our first book that we read and discussed was about the experience of the Black physician during this time period. For many of you who don't know, the Greene Book is a travel book that covers different businesses, projects, and even parks in around the United States. And during this period, in 1936 to 1967, Victor Greene wrote at least 4 editions of the Greene Book. And so what Ms. Taylor did in her book, which was very creative, she started by talking about a real experience with her stepfather, Mr. Ron. And when he would travel with her family, she never understood certain aspects of the travel preparation. And so what I would like Ms. Taylor to do is kind of explain the lived experience that started you on this journey with this.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be included, and thank you for hosting the exhibition. We're so excited that it made it to your museum. Yeah, I started documenting Greene Book sites in 2013, way before the film came out, and I had never heard of the Greene Book. I didn't know such a thing had existed. I was actually doing research on a book that I was commissioned to write on Route 66, and when I found out that half the counties on Route 66, there were 89 counties and about 44 of them were Sundown Towns, which were all white communities that were all white on purpose and were dangerous for Black people to be after dark. I thought, well, how in the world did Black people travel? especially on Route 66 or anywhere else throughout the country. And when I asked that question and doing that research, I stumbled onto the Greene book. I saw my first copy at the Autry Museum in Los Angeles. And it was really an inspiring, incredibly powerful moment in my life, because I knew that my life was going to change and that I was going to do everything I could for however many years it was going to take to uncover anything I could learn about the Greene book. And just to clarify, Victor Greene did create the Greene book. He was a postal worker from Harlem, and it was in publication till 1967, like you said, but he published many editions up into 1960 until he passed. And then his wife took it over, Alma Duke Greene, and she was a major player as well in the development and the success of the Greene book. So yeah, we're just, we're so blessed that the Schoenberg Center in Harlem has digitized these editions. They've digitized nearly every edition that we believe has been published. So if you Google Greene book, NYPL for New York Public Library, people can actually flip through the guide and see all of the businesses and the advertisements and the articles.
And so the actual, your book that you wrote, an inspiration came from a family member.
Right. Yes, my stepfather, Ron, well, I had known him since I was 12, and he was pretty much my dad, the only dad I knew. And we were never that, we got along great, but we were just never that, he didn't share a lot of intimate things with me. And I knew he was he'd grown up in the South in Memphis, Tennessee. He was a dark-skinned Black man, growing up during Jim Crow. And he always kept things real close to the vest. He was a Marine, he was very buttoned up. And, but it wasn't until I started doing this project that he started to tell me stories that I'd never heard and things that had happened in my family that I didn't know about. And I was reading about these things in the archives and doing my research. And so I would go home to Ohio and talk to Ron every time I went home, and I'd ask him, I heard that there were these chauffeur's hats that Black men used to put in their car, and they would be a ruse for the cops. And he would say, oh yeah, that happened to me when I was 7 years old. And then these stories would just tumble out of his mouth. And it was just so shocking to me to know that this history was in my family, but also to know that I'd known this man, most of my life. And through the trauma, I think, of him having grown and lived during this time and in this country, he was finally vulnerable with me. And what was so amazing was, as I was writing the book, he died literally the week I started to write the book. I've been researching the book since 2013. I started, I traveled throughout the country, drove about 50,000 miles, documenting different Greene book sites. And so when I sat down to write the book in, I believe, 2018, he dies that first week. And it was devastating to me. But because he had told me all these stories, the first 2 weeks of writing the book, I just wrote down all of his stories, and they became this narrative thread in the book that was very surprising. It never would have happened had he not died. So it was kind of a bittersweet blessing that I lost him at that time, because he really does humanize this history in a way that I could never have planned for. It was and I do think people who read the book, they walk away really learning, knowing, and loving Ron and his contribution to it. So yeah, he was a major factor in this process for me.
And as I read it, one, like you said, everyone can connect to it if you grew up in the South. One pretty much represents every man, every man in the Southern states that would travel and would lead his family to different areas. But as we think about the time period that everyone was living in and the opportunities, I like to paint a picture, which you did in this book. You said many of the people in the South had meager opportunities. They were maids, they were domestic workers, that's the females. The men were mechanics, and they had skill set to do different things in the community and to make a living wage for their family. But the one thing that many people didn't have access to was the vehicle, right? And so the Green Book would seem far-fetched for individuals that didn't have access to get a vehicle and to be able to travel, but it became a prized possession for the African American. And when they would travel, they would have to take some precautions in the process. And so when I was reading some of the stories that you interjected in there, I think you need to share with those that are here with us how the actual possession of a vehicle was just an influence in that time.
Yeah, the car was a critical part of it. Was a symbol of freedom, really. It made all the difference in terms of, you being this regular insult that you had to deal with in terms of, segregation. If you had a car, you didn't have to ride in the back of the bus. If you needed to travel north to, take a train, oftentimes, right when you passed the Mason-Dixon line, you were literally in the back behind the caboose, and all of your clothes would be covered in soot, and Black folks couldn't, they didn't sit in the same places in the trains that white people sat. And it was harrowing, sometimes dangerous experience to travel short or long distances in the country. And so if you had a car, it really liberated you in ways that it was incredibly powerful. And the car became such an important factor, especially in the 30s when the Green Book started, and also in the 60s. More 4 out of 5 families, Black families, had cars. A lot of times their cars were worth more than their houses. I mean, they spent more money on their cars because, again, it wasn't just a symbol of freedom, but it really allowed you to navigate the country or even your city or your town in a way without having, being vulnerable to all of the segregation and racist policies that were throughout America. So yeah, the cars is a major factor. And you see in the early editions, the first known edition that we have, 1936 was when the Green Book started, but no one's ever seen that edition. But the 1937 edition, which we do have, and you can look at the Schoenberg's website, 80% of all of the articles or the advertisements are for mechanics, and it's all about the car. It's all about where you can get gas safely and how you can get your car repaired safely. Because as much as, the car was a symbol of freedom, if it broke down, you were in trouble because you were still at the mercy of the roadside. And hopefully you weren't in a sundown town, or hopefully you were in a place where you could get help. So that was a huge part of the Green Book. And it just speaks to, any other travel guide that you would have seen for white people. That would not have been the case. It would not have had that many advertisements for car repair. But yeah, we can see that distinctly in this guide.
And just want to point out that the automobiles, even having an automobile was different, but then even getting car insurance, most African Americans didn't even have car insurance because they would not insure them. It was seen as a liability. So if you even had a car to travel with your family, your family didn't have insurance, so that pulled over by law enforcement. That was a whole other issue. And one of the stories you said in the book was that one of the motorists that was pulled over and when they went to court, they had to explain to the judge that I can't get insurance. So he did an actual, he researched it, and turns out most of the companies and what most African Americans love is a nice car. So the Cadillac was one that really everyone wanted, but Cadillac and GM and everyone refused to sell because it was on the shoulder. And so that's kind of taking you through what the possession itself of the vehicle was. So getting back to the Green Book, and the experience of utilizing it as a tool. You think of it as a phone book, right? That, was one of the strongest days. But it didn't even have phone numbers. What it had in there was a list of businesses. In the later editions, they had parks that you could go to, and they had entertainment spots. And as I mentioned earlier, musicians used this a lot when they were touring, so that they could have a safe place to rest at, and they knew what places they were open to. And she stated that the author was from Harlem. Can you connect all of that, the entertainment as well as the businesses and the sites that you are going to share in the book, and that's in the exhibit?
Yeah, it was an incredible, Victor Greene, I believe he was kind of the Steve Jobs of our time. He was solving a problem that was so, so many Black people, I think, didn't even realize how important and how much your life could change if you just knew where these places were located. What the Green Book was so brilliant at was it showed a nexus, or these, these different types of businesses, like you said, everything from nightclubs to tailors to haberdashers. There were drugstores in the Green Book. There were doctors. It was kind of this yellow pages for Black businesses. And so once you got to an area like South Central Los Angeles or Bronzeville in Chicago, there would be 80 plus Green Book businesses that were largely all Black owned in a Black community. And it was a safe zone for people. And so I think more than just the sites in particular, where you knew you could go to this restaurant, you could go to that hotel, what was more important is it brought you to this culture of Black vibrancy, these communities that were thriving in many ways. The irony of segregation is that we became so much more self-sufficient in terms of what we were able to accomplish, keeping our own communities safer and having more people employed. So it was a very enriching time, ironically, during the most segregated times in our country. But a lot of these communities were safe zones, especially for people who weren't familiar with the town or the city or the surroundings. So it was an incredibly exciting, I think, guide beyond just being a travel guide, because there were all these different businesses. And you can see later in the earlier editions is when they had this plethora of different types of businesses, but you see in the later editions, when it looks like integration is inevitable, Brown versus Board of Education passes in 1954. And so the writing is on the wall. A lot of anti-segregationists, all these people who were not on board with this, we're realizing, this is coming. And so then, of course, in the 60s, everything, the laws change. But Victor Greene, I think he knew that since this was happening, he took a lot of those types of businesses out, like all the drugstores and the nightclubs and the tailors. Those types of businesses are not in the later editions, because there's this assumption that Black folks could move or would be able to get services in these other, in these white-owned businesses. But the richest, most varied examples of what a travel guide could be, because it was beyond, no AAA guide is going to have tailors in it. So it just really speaks to, I think, how many places in the country that Black people were shut out of, and how this changed. And so that's why I wrote the book chronologically, to show the transition from the 30s to the 60s, and when that pendulum of justice would swing forward and then it would swing back, because we were never in a linear state where things were just progressively getting better. And so the book really, I set out to make sure that, we understand how history works. And that's how we are in our place today. When people, I was writing the book when, Trump was elected, And so many of my friends and people, call me and say, how can this happen? It's 2016. It's like, well, that's what happens with history, is that things move forward and then they come back. So the book was really, I set out to make sure that I showed that.
And you really did. My next question was about history, and you explained it. Just for those that are watching or listening, for instance, she talked about Ferguson, Missouri, which was at the time when the Green Book was wrote, 95% white, and they had attempted to diversify that small town, which would have been considered a sundown town during this time period. And now Ferguson, Missouri was in the heat of a lot of the police brutality situation within the last couple of years. And then she talks about Charlottesville as well, being a part of the additions of the Green Book as well. But just to point out how she said, with the irony of segregation, we wrote in the book about, in 1929, there was in the Chicago Tribune from the president of the New York State Parks Council. He stated the Negroes could make a definite contribution to good race relationships by remaining away from beaches where their presence is resented, as opposed to being inclusive at that time period in an area where you can do leisure resting for your family, entertainment. The Parks Council pretty much stated, the president stated, that Negroes should stay away. So the book was vital in ensuring that there was access to entertainment and recreation for families, with younger children. Mm-hmm. And so we're close to time, and I want to leave it open for anyone who has questions for Ms. Taylor in regards to the book before I ask my next question. Well, when we started the discussion, we talked about the connectivity and the relatability of the book and the travel experience for African Americans. It's a game day in Louisiana, Ms. Taylor, and so we love in South Louisiana football, and we love to travel to see football, whether it's Southern University or LSU. And growing up, my family traveled to every away game for Southern University. And you mentioned some things in the book that I never knew was actually a way of protection during travel, but we always would leave in the afternoon and at nighttime, which you indicated the book was a way of protection for families. You even talked about the women would pack care packages for the family. They would bring sheets and different aspects of clothing and even things that would help them not have to stop at locations to restroom. And so one of the things you mentioned was, and I'm going to say it wrong, but pretty much y'all, it's hog head cheese. And so they call it hog head cheese and saltines, and they would pack that to go away. My father loves hog head cheese. I could never understand why he would ever travel with hog head cheese. But now understanding that was something that was a non-perishable item that you could bring with you, you would have to stop it. And many of us, they still sell it at a lot of convenience stores in North Baton Rouge, but you just wouldn't think that that's part of it. And then the other thing that my parents would do, Ms. Taylor, would use sandwich bread on our sandwiches when we travel, so you wouldn't have to stop and eat cheese. I despise it as of today. But I understand now the value of preparation and travel. And so can you explain some of those little traditions and things that families did as they traveled that now we still continue to do?
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. I think, it's kind of like my experience with Ron when we learn, because as, when we're young, our parents, a lot of parents did shield us from those, harsh realities. And I read so many stories, of little boy with, his mom saying, oh, I want to have a Coca-Cola at this at this store, and because it was segregated, she's like, oh no, our Coke is better at home, so we're gonna go home, and or they don't have, she would make some kind of excuse about why theirs was better, and to shield the pain of those indignities. But I think in terms of Louisiana, it was such this thing about the South, which is fascinating, because when I was looking at Sundown Towns, and for people who want to learn more about them, look at James Lowen's work. He recently passed, but he is a premier historian on Sundown Towns, and he wrote a book called Sundown Towns. But there was this assumption that the South was so much worse than the North, because you had the Jim Crow signs, you had the white and colored signs, but the truth was, Jim Crow was pervasive throughout this country. And in some ways, those signs were even more helpful because at least you understood the terms. Because if you just stumbled onto a sundown town, and a lot of times they just have a sign at the county line saying, inward, don't let the sun set on you here, you had no idea what you were going to come up against when you were driving, because there was no map of sundown towns, there was no way to know. And so I think, the South gets a bad rap in terms of, being this kind of, they get demonized saying because you had the signs, but in some ways I just think you were more honest about the reality, because the lengths that the North went to, whether it was redlining or urban renewal or all of these major government forces that shaped these communities in this very backhanded, underhanded way, was really devious. And it was harder to fight because you can't fight something you can't quite see or you can't quite prove. And that was a real effective strategy. And at least, like I said, the South was very honest. We don't want you here. And a lot of people appreciated that, especially because they knew that, they could take their family somewhere else that was safe. But yeah, did you want me to talk about the Louisiana Green Book sites yet, or are we gonna wait?
I think it's time for, I think we got a presentation portion. So you can go ahead.
I'm sorry?
The Green Book portion about Louisiana. You can go ahead and
Okay. Yeah, there were about 200 Green Book sites in Louisiana, and half of them were actually in New Orleans. There were about 14 in Baton Rouge, but there were others in Lafayette and Lake Charles, Mansfield, Monroe, Morgan City, New Iberia, and Shreveport had some Green Book sites. But the one that was really special, and we didn't really cover this, but Esso was a major distributor and marketing partner for Victor Greene. Esso gas stations, which was Standard Oil back in the day, it's now ExxonMobil, who actually sponsored our exhibition, which was, incredible, because they did really have this history and they were on the right side of history at this time. But Esso was a major station that was a brand that Black people relied on, and they felt if they saw an Esso station, they knew they could get gas, because a lot of the rest of white-owned businesses, you weren't necessarily guaranteed to be able to get gas, and if you could get gas, they wouldn't let you use the restroom, or so it was very difficult. And Esso was this great brand that Black folks felt safe. So there was an Allendale Esso service center in Shreveport, Louisiana, and one of the Green Books, I believe it's a 1956 edition, actually has a photo of that gas station. And we just have so little evidence of Esso being tied to the Green Book. And even though it was a major player, and there were only a handful of Essos actually listed in the Green Book, it was kind of a word of mouth thing that Black folks just knew Esso was a solid choice. But to have that Shreveport, Louisiana Esso station featured, and I think it's a half a page ad with a photo of the actual business was pretty incredible. So people should take a look at that.
And I was definitely impressed when in the exhibit you will see that Esso and Exxon, who is a partner, a sponsor in this event, definitely provided fuel distribution for African Americans in the, during this time period. There was, I just lost my train of thought, but I wanted to include that you started by saying this was a large, it was considered a pride in the community, and because there were a lot of business owners that were promoted during this time period. Though it was a survival mechanism, it did help enhance their businesses. And so I realized that consumerism, we don't think about it that much, but it was definitely, now we market, diversity market to individuals and to groups. But at that time period, it wasn't even thought of. It was a true block on in marketing, just because they didn't want to provide access to African Americans and people of color. But there was another impact on this time period that you mentioned, and it was kind of segmented in the book about the emotional and health impact to African Americans. Because they wanted to travel, but there was a lot of stress that would come from traveling over. Could you talk about that a little bit?
The stress of traveling? Yeah, it was, you know, I think, like you were talking about, you know, with all the preparation, first of all, you know, there was that you had, because you only could prepare for so much. And if you had maybe camping gear, if you needed it, if you had an extra gas can, if you needed gas, you couldn't get gas. You know, so there were all these things you had to do to prepare. But then when you were on the road, you know, it was interesting to read stories about people who actually got into accidents. And if you were, say in Albuquerque, there was a string of accidents. NAACP actually had to get involved because there were so many, especially driving Route 66, because they had passed through the Ozarks and Missouri and all of these, you know, there were, Illinois and Missouri had hundreds, at least 200 sundown towns in each state. So by the time you got through Missouri and top part of Oklahoma and you were in Arizona, you may not have been able to find a place to rest. So a lot of people were getting into accidents. A lot of Black people were just exhausted because they had not found a hotel. And NAACP had to explain this to the trooper, like, this is why these accidents are happening. And in some towns, if you had an accident, when you would call the version of 911, they didn't have 911 back then, when you called the emergency line, sometimes the first question they would ask is the victim Black or white? Because that would determine whether or not they were going to come. And in some ways, it wasn't because they wanted you to die on the road, but if there wasn't, the ambulances were segregated, the hospitals were segregated. So if they didn't have a Black ambulance take you to a Black hospital, you were pretty much out of luck. And so, you know, you can't really prepare for that, right? So there were all of these concerns, you know, that when you were out of the safety of your community and you were just hitting the road like any other American had the right to do at that time, there were definitely provisions that had to be in place that you had to prepare for. And I think you had a resiliency and a fearlessness about you to be able to do it. So I really applaud the people who, you know, I think it's just really inspiring to read about, you know, people who just got on the road anyway. And I think they were obviously of a different generation and had different circumstances, and they probably didn't think it was as heroic as we do looking back on it today. But essentially, when you read these stories, and a few of them are in the book, you know, I think it really does reframe how we should think about moving through this country. And we do see parallels today. I mean, we do see Ferguson, you know, that hyper policing and pulling Black people over at 3 times the rate of white people. So it's not that, you know, things are, that we see parallels today. Some things are better, but some things are not. So yeah, it was really inspiring to read these stories.
So your book includes a lot of artifacts, not to mention the sites that visit, indicated you visit a number of sites, and you realize that most of them are not have not been preserved. This is Museum of the people here are interested in historical preservation. What has your research shown you about the sites or even the artifacts that you've taken from the sites across the country, and how we're preserving the history of this time period?
Yeah, you know, when I first started researching the Greene book, in about 2016, I actually got a fellowship at the Schomburg, and then I got a fellowship at Harvard with Dr. Henry Louis Gates, and I could have written the book at that point. I mean, I had done enough research, scholarly research. I could have written a book about Black history and travel in this country, but I knew that I had to find out how many of these sites and these businesses were still operating. And the only way to do that was to actually get out on the road. I mean, I've been writing, and I'm a photographer. I was an artist before I was anything else. And so, as I said before, you know, I drove about 50,000 miles throughout the country, documenting these places and figuring out, you know, what happened to these golf courses that were in the Greene book, and some of them are still operating. I found that less than 3% are still operating as the same business. There are hotels throughout, you know, LA has a lot of Greene book sites that are still operating, in Harlem, because there were so many, there were over 450 sites in Harlem. So I cataloged over 10,000 Greene book sites. At the time I was doing this, Wikipedia said there were only 1,500 Greene book sites because they were only using 2 editions to get their numbers. So there's a lot of disparities in terms of, you know, the research. And so I really felt like it was important that I basically do it myself and physically get out there and document these sites. But about 80% are still standing, like the buildings are, you know, I'm sorry, 80% are gone. So 20% of the buildings are still here, even if they're not operating as the same business. So I have been doing work with the National Park Service to get these buildings on the National Register, because we have found also within the system of the National Register, it's harder because these Black-owned businesses were sometimes in floodplains due to redlining and so many different ways that the cities were cut up, and, you know, Black businesses, you know, were decimated with urban renewal, with the freeway system. And so when there is a Greene book site, you know, I'm rewriting the context of how they should be considered for nomination for the National Register. So I'm really proud that, you know, the National Park Service has seen the kind of hole in how these places are nominated, and to really make provisions to make sure that these Greene book sites and other Black traveler guides, you know, the Greene book wasn't the only Black travel guide. There were nearly a dozen other ones. The Greene book was the most popular, and it was in publication the longest, and it had the largest audience, we believe. But, you know, there were other Black traveler guides as well. So it really broadens this landscape of race and travel and preserving our history, because we're losing these businesses and the people who ran them every day. And one last thing I'll say about this is, you know, for those who really want to learn about the people who ran these businesses, I got a grant from the Library of Congress to actually interview some of these business owners. So people like Leah Chase from Dookie Chase's restaurant, Martin Luther King's barber actually ran a business that was in the Ben Moore Hotel, which was a Greene book site in Montgomery, Alabama. So if you go to Library of Congress and type in my name, Candacy Taylor, and Greene book, you'll see those interviews come up if people want to actually have a living testimony to these places.
And you mentioned that there has not been much research on Mr. Greene, Victor Greene, but I did read he started the Greene book kind of modeling the Jewish travel guide, if I'm saying it correctly. There's a travel guide that realized one of his friends and made access to that. Were there any other things that you were able to find out about Mr. Greene, the author of the Greene book? And you added that his wife was a major component and partner in the last couple of years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we never had access to any of Victor Greene's business records. We know that his office was above Small's Paradise, actually, in Harlem, right at 7th and, well, Adam Clayton Powell is what it's called today, and 135th Street. And for those people who know Harlem, there's an IHOP there now, but upstairs was where Victor Greene's office was. And he was, you know, I interviewed Ramona, one of his family members, but it's been very difficult to get any concrete bookkeeping records or anything about the Green Book, even in the different artifacts that I've collected from Green Book sites, you know, all over the country. You know, I'm asking, are there any ledgers? Is there any letters or anything written that, you know, maybe Victor Greene had given you, or do we have any testimony? And it is heartbreaking that for the most part, from what we can tell, that history, that written history is gone. And even people who knew him, you know, I did get to interview Alma Duke Greene, his wife's relatives. But again, we just could not find any bookkeeping or visual records. But, you know, that's why I think it's important that we have meetings like this and sessions like this to keep it alive, because you never know, somebody's basement, you know, that Summer of Soul documentary that was just featured with Questlove, you know, that those tapes are just sitting in somebody's basement. So, you know, remains to be seen if they're really gone. But yeah, I think it's important that that we celebrate Victor Greene's genius and innovation, and then to have, you know, to have it go on until the 60s with Langley Waller, who took it over. And we believe that he probably is the one who dropped off those Green Books. Somebody in his family dropped off the Green Books to the Schomburg, which is why we even have them digitized. Because if that hadn't happened, I don't know, we wouldn't be sitting here today. In the Green Book, there would be no Green Book film. There would be no, you know, all of these other ancillary projects that have cropped up in the last few years, you know. So we're really blessed that we even have the Schomburg, and that they not just put those in their archives but the fact that they digitized them and made them available to us is really special.
So at this time, I want to just say to you, thank you for sharing with us your knowledge, sharing with us the experience that you gained, and taking it and putting it in a book that told history that sometimes is forgotten, and a history that we focus on the negative part of that time period, but there was so much pride in business ownership and entrepreneurship. There was at that time period, that's the time period that many of the land grant institutions were becoming in existence, and so many of African American families were starting to have access to education, higher education, and becoming citizens that could give back to the community. And so this Bible of travel, of Black travel, that you call the Green Book, is great, but your stories that you inputted to share with the community are what we can take back, and especially those of us who love history and literature together. And so, yeah, one question.
Hi, it's Annie. I'm the curator at Capitol Park Museum. I'm making sure you can hear me before I ask my question.
I can hear you.
Great.
Yes.
Okay, so you talked a little bit about how few extant sites are left, and I know at least so far, I know at least there are 3 in Baton Rouge, and there's some people doing great work on making sure that those are recorded as historical sites. But could you tell, and then you mentioned you are currently working on a framework for nominating sites that normally the National Park Service just passes over due to what they would call architectural insignificance. Would you be willing to tell us a little bit more about, maybe even sharing with the people who will see this video who are working on that, how you can make sure that those are added?
Well, you know, again, like I said, I'm rewriting the context for the Green Book sites for Route 66. So it's the Route 66 Preservation Corridor Program. That's who I have the grant with. So right now, this is really rewriting the context for Route 66's Green Book sites. But the idea is there's a man named Paul Luswingen. I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name correctly, but it's Luisgnan, I believe is how you spell it. And if people want to contact me offline, I'd be happy to share. But he's really an ally in this force. He's the one who really understands what the problem is and what the hurdles have been. Because originally I was supposed to nominate Green Book sites on Route 66, and I kept running into so many roadblocks. My grants administrator and I just got together and said, hey, why don't we just rewrite the context so it's easier for everybody? And so the goal is, once I get that done, which will be by the end of the year, is when it'll be processed and reviewed for the Route 66 sites. Then, my goal is to take that national so that any Black-owned business, historic business, a lot of those roadblocks will be removed. So yeah, I applaud your local historians who are working on getting those sites nominated. Let me know. They're welcome to reach out to me. But hopefully, every SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Offices in each state, they're also different. So I've never worked with the ones in Louisiana. I've worked with 8 different states, and they've given me at least 6 different answers. Yeah. So I don't know what kind of, hurdles you may run into, but I definitely, if there's anything I can do to help, let people.
Thank you. And could you explain for people who don't know what a context for a National Register is?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's essentially the parameters. It's outlining the parameters of what can make a property eligible for nomination. So a lot of times, for instance, I may find a Green Book site and that if everything, say it was a hotel and today it's a condo, but that front, the first floor may have been, the windows may have been changed, things may have been rearranged, because at once when it was a hotel, they had a lobby, but now there's this area where there may be an office, but they moved some walls. And then all of a sudden, if you can't find the floor plans from the 1940s that match up with the floor plans for today, then it can't be eligible for nomination. But everything else about the building is pretty much intact, and and it looks similar to what it was 40, 50, 80 years ago. So I kept running into problems like that. So rewriting this context or resetting the parameters, I'm going to say that is irrelevant. Really, if it was in the Green Book or a Black Traveler's Guide and it, looks anything like, there are just distinctive characteristics. We go into the architectural history of what that type of building, the eaves, what it should have looked like. And if there were major, if it's beyond recognition, then yes, okay, you have an argument that, it shouldn't be eligible for nomination. But I'm going through every single detail and making sure that it's as easy as possible. And when things are very straightforward, that we don't complicate it, because the point is, these places are so rare. They're so rare that, to just not protect them makes, it makes no sense. So yeah, it's, that's the definition.
So thank you again on behalf of the Capitol Park Museum and Next Son, Imagination Leads, and me. I'm just so excited to be able to talk with you. Thank you for spending some time with the Baptist community and sharing your work and your literature. Thank you to the pages that came.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for watching this presentation of the virtual 2021 Louisiana Book Festival. Please visit our official bookseller, Cavalier House Books, and receive 20% off all featured festival titles through the end of the year. A special thank you to our festival sponsors. The Louisiana Book Festival will return on October 29th, 2022.